Hello and welcome to This is the Way. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin T. Wald. This podcast, by the way, is brought to you by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong.
So, Justin, it's really good to see you again. And
Yeah, we've
and
been
I
churning out the episodes. So listeners won't know this right now, but it's summer and both of us have more, I guess, I wouldn't say that I have more free time in the summer because I'm trying to write 5 papers in one summer, but I have less structured time. My time is more unstructured. And so we're really trying to get lots of episodes done. Yeah, so we've seen a lot of each other. I actually look forward to it. It's like getting together with an old friend.
That's right. No, it's almost like kind of hanging out. And I always did envision that as part of like what would be so enjoyable about doing this
Oh,
podcast. And of course, we talk about philosophy, but we also kind of catch up. Also, I think we do here and there learn something new about ourselves or about each other. So one of the things I've been wondering about is some of your hobbies, and especially like you're a professional philosopher and a scholar. So you spend so much time reading more technical stuff, more scholarly literature. But,
yeah.
what else do you read, Justin? I mean, do you have any
Yeah.
so-called guilty pleasures of reading or
Guilty
watching?
pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got right to the heart of the question. Yeah, so I finished a book called The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese. It's a
Hmm.
really, but I feel like it's not really a guilty pleasure. Anyway, the answer to your question is yes, I do lots of guilty pleasure reading. I'm not as current on television as other people are. There are lots of kind of super popular television shows that seems like everyone but me has seen. I mean, I watched Game of Thrones like a lot of people and then got disappointed with the ending like a lot of people. But there are a bunch of things that I haven't seen. I still haven't seen, well, what's that sort of gangster show that was Sopranos, for example,
Uh-huh.
or
So
what was it called?
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you haven't seen Breaking Bad?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. I spent so much time talking about that show with, I remember Owen Flanagan when I was in Hong
Oh,
Kong. We were
yeah.
both super into that show. And that's one of the few shows that I watched all the way through with my wife, Shui Ying.
Wow,
And
yeah.
in Hong Kong, actually, when we were there, partly because we got extremely sick from food poisoning. And we were stuck for 3 days. And this is before we even had a kid. And I think we did one of those binge watching marathons, and we
Yeah.
watched all through Breaking Bad,
Wow, yeah.
because otherwise it is hard to find the time.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to have a special place in their heart. They have some memory of binge watching that show. And I tried watching it. So my spouse and I, we like to watch murder mysteries together. I don't love murder mysteries so much that I read them on my own or watch them on my own, but it's something we do together, you know? And so we thought Breaking Bad might be in that genre or close enough, but it wasn't quite. Didn't quite have the familiar, comforting formula of a true murder mystery where it's all wrapped up in a single episode or
The
two.
more recent contemporary one is Knives Out. Have you ever seen
Ah,
that?
yes, I did like that one. Yes, we saw that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that
That
was
was
great.
quite enjoyable, I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really fun. Yeah. But anyway, I didn't want to punt on the opportunity to talk about guilty pleasures. I kind of like hanging out my laundry for everyone to see. So just by the way, like back when I was co-authoring a book with Steve Engel, he's a alumnus of Yale and Yale University. We were working on a book together and he had his newsletter sitting on his desk. And one of the items on the newsletter was, we ask Yale literature professors what their guilty pleasure readings are. And we had so much fun with it because it was absurd, the newsletter. It was just like their idea of guilty pleasure reading was like one tier down, one step down from the highest, hardest, most difficult kind of good for you literature out there, you know, like stuff that's still reviewed in the New York Review of Books and by
Hmm.
sophisticated people and such, but was
Hmm.
not quite, top tier, like a really difficult. So they were not listing Thomas Pynchon. Everyone understands that's like hard work and that's you do it because it's good medicine or something. But it
Hmm.
was like, I don't know, Murakami or something. And Murakami is not light.
Hmm. Right. It's not even Stephen King.
Oh, no way. It was miles apart
Okay.
from Stephen King
Okay.
or Harry Potter or what have you. Basically, I think my two favorite genres for guilty pleasure reading are historical fiction and fantasy. So I just finished a really long series. I think it was a trilogy, but I read it as an ebook. So it was, probably it could have been 4 or 5 books for all I know, thousands of pages called The Live Ship Traders. And it was by someone named Robin Hobb. She's a really interesting author who herself has a lot of experience on boats. So it's kind of a fantasy world where Everyone sort of works in as like kind of naval merchants, merchant marines, and two of the three main characters are women, and they live in a society that has sort of familiarly ambiguous views or attitudes towards women being in charge of things. Anyway, so that's one guilty pleasure reading. After I've just finished a book that I mentioned. Next up is a book that I promised to read, promised my niece that I would read. I sometimes read books at the recommendation of my niece, Josephine. She's the kind of reader who goes through, I don't know, 5 to 7 books a week. If it's a holiday, it might be even more than that. And she recommended, there's a lot of excitement about these kind of, it's called The Song of Achilles, which is a kind of fictional reimagining of the relationship, both friendship and romantic relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. You know, that character in the Homeric version who gets, is it taken captive? And thus leads Achilles to his kind of tragic downfall. Anyway, so yeah, those are the sorts of things. For historical fiction, if you want to know what kind, I mean, there's this book, I, Claudius, that was really popular, I think in the 80s. I was too young to appreciate it then, but I've read it several times since then. And I just kind of like projecting myself into another time and another world.
Well, you still seem, even your guilty pleasures, I mean, no, it's not quite like at that level that with the Yale alumnus, but it still seems a bit more refined than certainly me. I mean, I think I can still watch through like Happy Gilmore and Adam Sandler movies. I mean, I'm still at that level. And yeah, I guess those would be, my sort of guilty pleasures of watching at least and reading.
Oh, I thought of one thing that people sometimes sniff at is reality television. And and my spouse loves Great British Bake Off. I sometimes watch that with her.
I've seen it. It's really good. That's a good quality show, though. My spouse and I have watched America's Got Talent. We used to watch that for our fourth kid. And actually, it's a very good show. Yeah. Well, but it's a very good show. America's Got Talent. Totally would recommend it. It's very easy to watch, obviously. Yeah, that's right. So America's Got Talent, that was sort of our guilty pleasure. And it was kind of light. You know, we didn't want to usually be a little bit late. And, you know, she doesn't want to watch anything like dark or too deep. We ended up choosing that show. And we would recommend it still.
Yeah, it's funny to me that just in terms of like cultural, I've noticed that in the world of sort of intellectuals, professors, it's not just the Yale literature professors. There are a lot of people who are afraid to admit to their guilty pleasure reading, but not their guilty pleasure television watching. Maybe I'm imagining this, but it's just sort of a tendency I've seen. So like they're reluctant to admit to reading Harry Potter or Tolkien or something, or Stephen King or whoever the latest version of Agatha Christie is, you know. But they will admit to watching Breaking Bad. I guess that's because in a way, with the help of critics and such, a lot of popular television is seen as like pretty sophisticated. You know, it's like good for you television somehow.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I was reading Dune for the first time. Have you read Dune?
Oh, yes. I read that. Okay. Yeah.
But that's like a very good quality. It's a really good book. So I don't know if that really counts as guilty pleasure, although
some people might count it. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking of guilty pleasure as a bit more like low grade, like a little more kind of maybe trashy romantic novels or something like that. I mean, although I just, wouldn't be able to get into it, I guess, myself.
Yeah. I think like the page turner stuff. So I'm trying to think of like really good.
Like really Tom Clancy, those like, although I've never read any of that stuff, like The Rainmaker. No. Like, have you read much of that? Like those, like what you would find at the airport, right? Like they punch those out like every year.
When I was
John Grisham, right? John Grisham would be another.
I sometimes find myself reading a book where I think, "Wow, this is a page turner," and I'm usually kind of reading for understanding, but now I find myself reading just to know what happens next, and then maybe that is an example that really shows that I'm just engaging in a guilty pleasure level kind of read. I really liked Anne Rice when I was in college. I remember I read a lot of Anne Rice, who wrote these vampire stories, usually that took place in New Orleans. And there's a science fiction series that Steve Engel got me started on called, it's like there's a television show, but I haven't seen the television show. It's called The Expanse, and it's about people living in the kind of far-flung parts of the universe. So it's sort of a near future to more distant future page turner type science fiction story, although it's not that superficial. Anyway, yeah, I'm struggling to like really come up with some terrible confession here comparable to America's
Yeah,
Scott
well, we can
Townley.
always revisit this. So maybe you should get on some kind of a plan to read treasure stuff so
Yeah, right. Yeah.
we can bring it up next
Yeah.
time. But in a way, this conversation is fitting for, I think, our today's episode,
Yep.
because today's topic is on playfulness in the Zhuangzi. And so we actually, to discuss this, we have
Yeah.
a very special guest, Pauline Lee from St. Louis University. And we
Yes.
will be talking about this, a really intriguing topic with her.
Yeah. So Pauline Lee, she's a professor of religious studies or theological studies. In many ways, she comes from our world. I met her back when we were both graduate students, and we were in a reading group with our teacher, mentor, PJ Ivanhoe together. And so we were reading, that's kind of back in the early days when I was just getting started on reading classical Chinese philosophical texts in the original language. And I've known her all these years, and she's a scholar with lots of interests, but she has this interesting new take on Zhuangzi as someone who's a kind of theorist of, or maybe an exemplar of play. And it's a very useful lens through which to see the text. So she's written a paper that we read beforehand. We've already recorded the discussion. It went so well. She's such an engaging
She's such a
conversationalist.
great speaker. And you could tell she's an amazing teacher. Well, I already know that. I know she's won awards, I believe, at St.
Oh,
Louis
wow.
University.
Yeah.
And also it's just such a kind, warm person. Yeah, she was extremely nice to me when I was a postdoc at St. Louis
Oh,
University.
yeah.
And so she was also very friendly to my wife, Shui Ying. Yeah, so she's just overall a great human being.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She's really, in the well-rounded sense, an amazing human being. Yeah, so we'll meet her in segment 2 of the show, which is just after the intermission music.
All right, so we are back. And as noted, we have a very special guest to discuss the Zhuangzi and the intriguing concept of play, Professor Pauline Lee, who is a faculty member of theological studies at St. Louis University. Hi, Pauline. It's great to have you here today.
Hi, Richard. It's really great to see you, and Justin, too. And thank you for inviting me to join your show.
Thanks, Pauline. I just had this strong feeling that you'd be a really good person to have on, and I'm so glad we found something to discuss.
I love the Zhuangzi. I'm always happy to talk about it.
Yeah, that's sort of right. That's sort of how I feel about the Zhuangzi too. Yeah, so I feel like since I've known you for a long time, I should give the kind of full-length introduction.
Right,
So,
decades, right?
yeah, at least 2 decades. I think we first met when we were both visiting the same graduate program, and where PJ Ivanhoe was, who was a dissertation advisor to both of us, although we both got our PhDs at different universities. And he liked to run regular reading groups where he'd read old texts in classical Chinese. And we just became friends. There was a lot that we'd hang out and talk a lot. But I particularly remember those reading groups because at your initiative, we read a lot of Li Zhi, this late Ming neo-Confucian philosopher who is certainly got to be in the running for Chinese intellectual history's most interesting philosopher, a kind of early proto-feminist, and just this guy who embraced authenticity as a way of life and encouraged other people to live authentically. And anyway, so we read lots of his stuff. And I remember even then being astonished to discover that, like, back when I was, I don't know, 18 or something or 17 and just learning how to play card games and hanging out with friends and doing nothing in particular that was particularly ambitious, you were an Olympic figure skater and competing in the Olympics. If I remember correctly, Pauline, you said then that you met these people who were sort of famous in the Winter Olympics for being amateurs, like the Jamaican bobsled team. Is that right?
That's right. You have a really good memory.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that was a great summer when we read Liezhi together. And I took Eric Hutton, certainly, who is a Chinese philosopher scholar. I think I invited PJ too. And I don't remember if you came with. We went ice skating too that summer.
Oh, really?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that. I certainly have gone ice skating.
We'll do it sometime, Justin.
Okay, yes, it'll be humiliating for me, but I should do it nonetheless. I'm sure it would be good for me.
Wait a minute, so we don't pass this by. So you met the people from the movie Cool Runnings? Was that the reference?
Yeah.
Indeed, yes. I have a photo. Wow. I have a photo of that.
Really?
I'll send it to you. I'll go find it and send it to you.
Yes, I'd love to see it. And you
Mhm.
also
That's
said
such a
you,
magical movie too. That movie is it's kind of like Sandlot. Yeah, it's one of these cult classics for anyone who's never seen it. It's worth
yeah,
watching.
yeah. And there's another person from that era that if you kind of live through the era as I did, you'll remember him because he was sort of a crazy person and a little notorious. But because there was no movie made about him, a lot of people don't know him now. His name was Eddie the Eagle, and
Oh,
he was like
yes,
this.
I met him too. Right.
Yeah,
He was
he
very
was.
courageous.
That's a good
It
way
was
to put it.
absolutely the Olympic spirit in both cases, and thrilled, super thrilled to be there.
I'm sure. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah, that
really,
was, I
really
forget
remarkable.
these things, Justin. I love talking to you. Yeah,
Yeah,
we can
yeah.
talk about all sorts of things.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm a very sentimental, kind of nostalgic person, so I tend to commit a lot of these sorts of memories to my long-term
Hmm.
memories.
I remember reading together, and that was, in fact, the beginning for me of writing my dissertation on Li Zhi that I then turned into a book. So
Yeah,
you were formative in helping me think about the basic documents I was going to use in my book.
yeah. Oh, I'm so
It was
glad to hear it,
fun. Yeah.
that I played at least some token symbolic role. And
Significant.
yeah, this is our theme for today is probably not surprising for someone who would be drawn to Liger, who's a very experimental Neo-Confucian philosopher. And that theme is play or playfulness in the Zhuangzi, in the text of the Zhuangzi. So Zhuangzi is maybe the lesser known Taoist of the two classical Taoist philosophers, but he's the one that's been most often discussed on this podcast. We often find ourselves coming back to Zhuangzi and certain passages in the Zhuangzi. I think probably those of you who've been listening to us for a while now already have a sense of the way in which his prose is playful. So there's a way in which you could say his very text, his very, writing is playful. He often makes his points. The authors make their points through stories and experimental arguments and analogies and so on. But there's also a sense in which the text seems to be recommending a kind of playfulness to people. And in order to get a sense of why that might be an appropriate way of describing the way of life that the Zhuangzi recommends, I think it's useful to just think about some salient features of play. So I was going to start by doing that. And here I'm taking my cues from a paper that you've written, Pauline, that I really enjoyed on play in classical Chinese philosophy. But it seems to me that following you, at the very least, we could start with a kind of minimal account of play, according to which play is a joyful or delightful activity, or maybe we could say, activity that's meant to be joyful or delightful. You're still maybe in some sense playing baseball or playing a board game, even if you're not particularly enjoying it at the moment. That also seems to be purposeless. So the quote I'm thinking of is you say it's joyfully or delightfully purposeless activity. And I think that's right. There's a sense in which when you're playing something, be it a game or, playing at, having a kind of job or what have you, even playing a game like hide and go seek, it's understood that your activity doesn't have, in some sense, it's walled off from real world consequences. So it's not supposed to have the kind of purpose or aims that we normally associated with real life. Maybe that's a good way of putting it. So that then leads some theorists of play, most famously this Dutch anthropologist whose name I cannot pronounce, to say that there's like, when you're engaged in play, it's as though there's a kind of magic circle. And it's sort of, there's a well-defined area where it said, okay, at this time in this place, we're playing. And then there's a boundary that's meant to be kind of not too permeable between that and the real world. So, the consequences of, say, getting rich when you're playing Monopoly in the game world don't necessarily spill over and aren't supposed to spill over to the real world, at least kind of in principle, or it's like a shared or agreed upon fiction that everyone partakes in, this magic circle. And if I could try to sort of sum up what is one of the more stimulating proposals that you have in your paper on Zhuangzi and play, it's probably that you kind of doubt that, at least in Zhuangzi's case, there really is a magic circle. You think that for Zhuangzi, in fact, there's either a very permeable boundary or there's just no boundary at all between the kind of play state or the play phases and the real world state and real world phases. And so that kind of calls into question this idea that it's a purposeless activity. Well, anyway, yeah, so that's my attempt to sort of sum up what I think the main issues are. Have I done it justice?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. The Zhuangzi is one of my favorite texts. It sounds like it is one of many, many, many people's favorite texts.
Yeah.
And if I were stranded on an island, I really think that Zhuangzi might be my first or second choice. I'm working on a project on the subject of play and trying to retrieve the many, many, many different, and I am looking to retrieve just a small handful of ideas of what play might be. And there's so many different ideas of play. And I'm looking at play in the history of Chinese thought. And I think that what we find in the Zhuangzi serves as a helpful kind of contrast to one very common, well-developed, it is persuasive too, but it is one common understanding of what play is, and it would be within something like and I can't pronounce this Dutch anthropologist's name either, but it's a very famous book called Homo Ludens, and I think I will give a stab at it, and it is Huizinga, Johann Huizinga.
Okay.
And he does use that word magic circle, and he makes a claim that play is actually so many different places. He, at the same time, uses that term magic circle, play happening something within it. He talks about play as on a card table, on a stage, in a, tennis court, in a temple. And so those are all quite circumscribed spaces. And he says play happens within this kind of thing like a magic circle. And while we can argue, and there's debate, what kind of permeability he speaks about in his highly influential book from dating to the 1950s. People in recent times have used his idea and his term, the magic circle, and developed this idea of play happening as within a circumscribed space. I think Zhuangzi is giving us a really different view. And it's just one of countless, countless, countless. And to me, I feel like I retrieved like 7 or something, but one of countless, countless views of play in China. And it's an interesting one.
Yeah, great. If listeners get a chance, we'll link to the paper when we finally release this episode. And they'll see that you have these other accounts of play that come from other texts. So Zhuangzi's is not the only one under the microscope in this paper. It's all very interesting. Yeah, so we are sort of settled on 2 passages to focus on sort of related to this topic. So one is I'm going to call the gourd passage, and I'll get to that in a little bit because we'll read that one first. The second one, just to give listeners a kind of early alert, is one that we've discussed before. It's essentially the monkey trainer passage, which Richard and I haven't talked about this yet, but our first episode was on the monkey trainer passage. And for some reason, that one is far and away the most popular episode. It's the one I've gotten the most feedback on, just enormous amounts of feedback from people. It's been listened to over 2,000 times, and we're, like 5 or 6 months into the show. Anyway, that passage is really fascinating. And I assume that many of you will already know it because you've heard that episode. But if not, I'm going to give you kind of a brief recap before we read some lines from that passage. Lines that, as it turns out, we basically neglected. We didn't talk very much about in that other episode. So this will be our chance to drill down a little bit on these later lines. Yeah, but first, the gourd passage. So Pauline has...
you want me to read it?
Yeah, you've generously offered to do so. That's really nice. I think it's important for people to hear other voices besides mine and Richard's. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read this. You had suggested I pick a couple passages that we could focus on. And it was very difficult, as you can imagine, Justin, because there's so many, many, many. And this one I really like. And partly it makes me think back to when I was an undergraduate and I was first introduced to the Zhuangzi.
Yeah.
And I remember reading it. We were assigned, Li was a professor, if you remember him. And I remember opening up the book, and it was A.C. Graham's great translation. And here I'm going to use Burton Watson's translation. And also we have Brooks Zaporin's translation that we were talking about just yesterday, right, Justin? And the Zhuangzi begins with, says fish. Is that right? Yeah. There's in the northern darkness, there's a fish, and his name is Kun. The Kun's so huge, I don't know how many thousand li he measures. He changes and becomes a bird whose name is Peng. I can still, because I feel honored to be able to teach undergraduates and especially first semester freshmen, who I love that they approach this with, maybe we could call it like a beginner's mind, that I can revisit it every time I teach this course. I feel this privilege of being able to like revisit and rethink what it was like when I first read it as a 19-year-old. And it was a sense of like, this is so strange. I don't understand. It's so thrilling. And I'm not sure what to make of it. And this sort of like holding on to something that was murky and sort of very, very slippery, but yet super, super fascinating.
Yeah.
I like this passage here about what we're calling it the gourd passage, right? It's a very famous passage. It's in the very first chapter of the 33 chapters that come down to us on this classic, the Zhuangzi. It's called Xiao Yao You, Free and Easy Wandering. And I like it. First of all, it's relevant to my present interest on the subject of play or playfulness, which I think is an understudied topic. So like children were at one time, women were a long, long time ago. And I think that play is actually a really understudied topic, and especially when we talk about ethics and virtue. So I think this is relevant, and this passage. And also I like it so much because it's like so common, so like sort of common. I mean, it talks about gourds, it talks about bleaching, it talks about earning money, it talks about making enough money, it talks about worrying, it talks about like having a little bit of fun. And so, how do you read this text? And I like this as an example of how to read a text that's so mysterious and so sometimes seemingly outlandish and so incredibly like not understandable, it seems, but yet it's actually super understandable if you just go and read it. Should I read it first and then I'll brainstorm how to read it?
Yeah, I think so. Many of our listeners know it, but many don't. So I feel like I should give them a little bit of a preface about
Okay.
gourds themselves.
Sure. Oh, great. And then I'll read
Yeah.
it.
So in ancient times,
I'm obviously very excited to read this passage.
yeah, no, yeah, thank you very much. Just so people know, like a gourd in ancient times was seen as a useful thing. And that's going to sort of set the stage for this notion of use and uselessness, which is an important theme in this passage. And so what was it useful for? Well, it was supposed to be, speaking of permeability, like, relatively impermeable so that you could, after you've had the gourd, obviously, first of all, some gourds were edible, or at least the insides were edible. But then once you took out the insides, the innards, as it were, you had this shell, which you could use kind of like a canteen just to kind of carry your liquids or fluids or waters around to drink from. Or you could cut them in half and turn them into like big serving spoons or dippers. And so if you lived at the time that Zhuangzi and his friend Huizi, who are the two characters in this dialogue, lived, then it would have been obvious to you that that's what gourds are for. They're for like basically canteens and dippers. And so that's what the discussion is about, really. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start reading it. It's about 2 paragraphs long. And this is the translation from Burton Watson, his all 333 chapters of the Zhuangzi. And it begins with, so some people who are listening will be super familiar with the Zhuangzi, and many of us will be much less familiar. I don't think it really matters. We can understand it really meaningfully. I think it changes our lives too, in whatever is our experience when we first read the Zhuangzi. So it begins with this, Huizi, the logician, a historical figure in that time and place. So Huizi said to Zhuangzi, Master Zhuang, the king of Wei gave me some seeds of a huge gourd. I planted them, and when they grew up, the fruit was big enough to hold 5 pickles. I tried using it for a water container, but it was so heavy I couldn't lift it. I split it in half to make dippers, but they were so large and unwieldy that I couldn't dip them into anything. It's not that the gourds weren't fantastically big, but I decided they were no use, and so I smashed them to pieces. Zhuangzi said, you certainly are dense when it comes to using big things. In Song, the state of Song, there was a man who was skilled at making a salve to prevent chapped hands. And generation after generation, his family made a living by bleaching silk in water. A traveler heard about the salve and offered to buy the prescription for 100 measures of gold. The man called everyone to a family council, and he said, for generations we've been bleaching silk, and we've never made more than a few measures of gold. Now, if we sell our secret, we can make 100 measures in one morning. Let's let him have it. The traveler got the salve and introduced it to the king of Wu, who was having trouble with the state of Yue. The king put the man in charge of his troops, and that winter they fought a naval battle with the men of Yue and gave them a bad beating. A portion of the conquered territory was awarded to the man as a fief. The salve had the power to prevent chapped hands in either case. One man used it to get a fief, while the other never got beyond silk bleaching, because they used it in different ways. Now, you Huizi, had a gourd big enough to hold 5 pickles. Why didn't you think of making it into a great tub so you could go floating around the rivers and lakes instead of worrying because it was too big and unwieldy to dip into things? Obviously, you still have a lot of underbrush in your head.
Yeah. As the Zhuangzi reports their relationship, basically Huizi and Zhuangzi were best friends. They were really close friends. Sort of like, I mean, Huizi was, thought to have a different philosophical orientation, but they're friendly rivals. They really like each other.
Right.
And so they have these debates.
Mhm.
Zhuangzi usually gets the upper hand, and clearly he does here. He says,
and it is his book. So, right.
yeah, exactly. So it's the right of the author. But yeah, I like to kind of recap a little bit in case listeners, just tuned out for a second. So basically there's the King of Wei has given Huizi supposedly worked for the King of Wei, by the way. He had sort of a high office under him. As kind of a gift or compensation or reward, he was given these seeds that made huge gourds. The idea is the gourds were normally gourds are valuable things, but it turns out they were too big to be valuable as he saw it, because he thought they were so big they were useless. Why were they useless? Because they couldn't be used in the two ways that people use gourds. They couldn't be used as canteens or as dippers. So then Zhuangzi tells this long story about a kind of some sort of concoction or salve that's meant to prevent chapped hands that was used in one way by a family for multiple generations and then used by someone else for something much more valuable by someone else. And then he says, so you have a similar problem with your gourds. You're not being very imaginative enough in thinking about the ways in which you could use these gourds. Why not just make a big old canoe essentially and float around the rivers and lakes? So there are many ways of characterizing what's going on here. One way that I'm tempted by comes from Edward Slingerland, who's written, I can't remember which book it is, but I'll put it in the show notes once I figure out which one it is. He says, drawing on contemporary cognitive science, that what you see here is what he calls categorical flexibility. And so apparently there are these studies, there are ways of sort of assessing people for their categorical flexibility. And very, very consistently, adults score very lowly, very, very poorly on these tests, and then young children do very well. So I think his example is like a brick or something. You ask an adult like me, what is this brick for? What can it be used for? And we'll say, well, you can, sort of make a road with it, or you can make a wall. And then immediately you start sort of struggling, like, I don't know, maybe you could put something in your garden. It already becomes a difficult thing for you. Children apparently have no problem coming up with lots and lots of ideas just spontaneously without sort of self-censoring or anything. And so they'll say things like, oh, it can be the altar for the sacrifice ritual of a doll or what have you. I mean, they just come up with can be a doorstop, so that's supposed to be evidence of categorical flexibility. And Zhuangzi seems to have that in a way that Huizi does not, which in fact gets him to think more open-mindedly about uses of things. That's one way of understanding the passage, but I feel like it's just a surface level interpretation. There's so much more to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's really a great way to think about what's going on here. And there's always so many, many, many layers to the Zhuangzi, which is partly why it's such a fascinating text. I think all of us have taught this text in the maybe 3-digit numbers. And every single time, my freshmen love this when I say it, every single time I, in fact, truly do find something new because there's so many different layers or something that I didn't quite understand. And it's this aha. And I really like this categorical flexibility idea. So Zhuangzi is able to think right outside, much, much outside the box. And Huizi, he is a logician. He's a leading logician at that time. And we think they were best friends. And because they were such good friends, they take each other very seriously. And they have these debates that go all the way through every single one of these chapters. Huizi is sort of made fun of by Zhuangzi as this person who holds on very tightly, systematically, brilliantly to this way of looking at the world, which is through logic. So Zhuangzi then, of course, has much more categorical flexibility. I think, too, when I read the Zhuangzi, I wonder, when you read the Zhuangzi, you open up the text. And one of the things I wonder about is when he gives us images, and he does that so often. So if I had just pointed out that when you open up the Zhuangzi, the very first chapter, this is in the very first chapter, the very first line is about a bird that is the Peng bird, who is, I think it's something like, I don't know how many thousand li.
Its wingspan is, I don't know how many thousand li.
So a li is a third of a mile. And then, so that would mean minimally, he's at least, or she, or the bird, Peng,
Mm-hmm.
is at least 300 miles, which is extraordinary. And then maybe that's like fantastical. And Zhuangzi might be saying something like, we can't see this in this world. It is so out there. But let's just like set our like imagination way, way, way far out there, something fantastical. So I think Zhuangzi does that in a lot of his book, a lot of his writing, and he's opening up our minds and showing us the abundance and resources in this world and how vast the cosmos is and how vast the world is, and the sort of scarcity is not, you don't find that sense, this competition and scarcity in his text. And I think partly it's he's sort of lifting our horizon higher and higher and higher. The pung bird, to me, though, if it's a 300-mile wingspan bird who then changes into a fish, to me, it's more fantastical. But I think that when I read through it, I like to like just look and see like this gourd thing. So it's a gourd, and it's the who gourd, right? So you can look it up and see what kind of gourd it is, and see like how big did it get. And then you had already said that it has a kind of impenetrable water barrier to the gourd. And so how do you read this? Partly is my question. And I think for Zhuangzi, it's you read it by reading it. And I think back when I was an undergraduate, and I was like, how do you read this? What do I do with this? You actually read it like you read it. And it's, in fact, maybe a simple thing to read the Zhuangzi, and you just look at it and see who is Huizi, who is Zhuangzi, who's the king of Wei. And you can find out, actually. You can look at the Zuozuan, and you get all these stories about the king of Wei at that time period. You can find out about each of the warring states, and there's Yue and Wu and Song. There's a state of Song here, and we know that the state of Song, the stereotypically the foolish people, which is the fallen elites, the rulers of the previous period, like found their way into the state of Song. And then the people from the state of Song then are sort of spoofed throughout many of these texts in the warring states period.
Yeah.
So if you look at this, gourd is central here. And so, like, what is it? And he says there's this gourd, and it holds 5 picos, 50, so 5 stones, literally. And then he says, why didn't you think of making it into it's like a vessel, right? Why didn't you think of making it into a jing, a vessel? And then you could float Fu over the rivers, Hu and Jiang over the rivers and lakes. And so I'm wondering, like, partly when I read him, I'm wondering, like, is he putting out something that's just like out there, like fly me to Pluto? Or is it fly me to the moon, which we actually can do now? Or is it something more like, what? You can finish your dissertation. Like, where is he at when he's showing us how vast the world is? And I think here, I like this because I think this is more it's super simple, guys, or it's actually really easy. Look right here. And it's very available and very accessible. And so Zhuangzi does name many things throughout his 33 chapters, or originally 50 chapters. So we know the 33 chapters. He names like plants and birds and all sorts of things. And they actually really exist. And I think it's philosophically fascinating because he's showing like we are like narrowly looking somewhere and we think there's just like, I don't know, the fern and the whatever cactus. But actually there's this like plant tree, literally, we know this, that lives 5,000 years, that lives in our world, and we can actually go see it with our own eyes. And I think this too, with this passage, this very short passage on the gourd, it is something that's right before our eyes that you can actually do. So in order to defend this claim, Justin, which is not a philosophical defense, I thought one should go and look and see, like, what is 5 picos, and can a gourd actually grow to 5 picos? And if it can, if you take out its contents, can you actually float it? And I think those are important hermeneutical tasks or skills that we ought to cultivate, and fun to cultivate. And it sets you in that time and place to like imagine when Zhuangzi says this, is this something you can actually really do, or is he just making this kind of thing up and thinking it'd be kind of cool if you could, but I don't know if you can. I think that it's really important to set ourselves. I mean, it seems kind of silly in some ways. And when I asked my research assistant to help me figure out if he could actually do this, was a little bit like skeptical that this was his task for the month. I gave it to him for the month. But I think it's very significant because you put yourself in that time, that specific time and specific place. I think that I'm going to make the claim that you can actually do that better or worse, really imagine ourselves. And there's this common humanity and common human experience, no matter how different it nevertheless is. And we can like put ourselves with a little bit of effort, travel and have this grand adventure and meet Zhuangzi at this time, which is Warring States, China. He's from the state of down here. What is that one? He's from the state of Chu. Right. So he's from down here. Okay, so this guy, they're talking about the Wei king giving Hui's these seats.
Just to give listeners a sense, Pauline is kind of with her hands setting up a map of the Warring States. Yes.
Yeah, and you can easily look it up on, I think, figuring out the geography, looking at where these states are, and just like reading it like very simply, like as if they're directions. Like, what does it mean, 5 Peoples? What does it mean, the King of Wei? I think that is so philosophically extraordinarily illuminating of what Zhuangzi is doing. So if you go look at the gourd, and I'm like going on a bit, Justin, so I'm almost done.
It's okay.
If you think about these gourds, they actually do. You can go look up on the web. I'm from the state of Minnesota. We used to have like competitions for like 4-H club competitions. How big could you grow it was zucchini or pumpkins or pigs. And if you go look on the web, you can actually find gourd competitions or pumpkin competitions. And they do grow to be this size and even bigger. So I think this is correct. And someone who specifically works on the Zhuangzi, I work on the Ming period too. I work on the 16th century thinker Li Zhi. So this is like taking me back a couple centuries much earlier. So someone who is very much a specialist of this time could tell you if I'm right about this, but I believe a stone is something like, I looked it up in some dictionary. It's something like maybe 60 kilograms or 130 some pounds. If it's 5 stones, then that is 600 pounds. And how big is that? And that, if you go look it up, is in fact a gourd that you can grow a gourd that big and even bigger. And it's about the size of like a bathtub or like a half of, or your library study, that kind of size. Wow. So you can actually grow it and you could actually sit in it. And if you empty it, of the insides of it, you could actually sit in it, maybe make it into a vessel. So then the next question, if you're going to put yourself in that time and place and think about if Zhuangzi is actually just making up like really fantastical things or actually something maybe you could do, this is something you want to know if it actually floats or not. And it was kind of weirdly, Richard and Justin, when I had read it so many times, and then when I realized you can actually float down in a river in such a gourd, and there's like competitions in North America where people race pumpkins. So you can actually do this. It was very eye-opening to me, and it made me think about this text. It sounds like maybe trivial or frivolous to go figure out if this actually floats, but it made me think about this passage of the Zhuangzi and maybe like other parts that I looked at in the Zhuangzi differently, because I think that Zhuangzi, in part, there's this expand your imagination. And I think that there's this follow-up message, which is expand your imagination with ease. It's easy, actually. We like so stressed and we fret and we like think we have to work so hard to like make life different or better, but actually just look. And if you just look, you'll actually see the 5,000-year-old some sort of tree that really does exist. Or you'll see you actually can float down a river in a gourd, and that's something you really can do. And I want to say, Richard and Justin, that we actually ought to do sometime as Chinese philosophers to celebrate this one. But a long answer then to, you said like flexibility in your categories. I think that's absolutely something that we don't know what Zhuangzi was trying to do, but that's certainly how I read the text. I like that categorical flexibility, I like that term a lot, that from some book of Edward Slingerland's. And I also like the Zhuangzi is actually a very easy text to read, and you just read it and figure out what he's in fact saying by understanding the very small things, specific things like, what is this pumpkin? Does it float? How big is it? Could it actually get that big? And the answer is yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah, actually, hearing about your investigation into real life gourd floating, gourd boating reminds me, yes, that in fact, there are so many stories in the Zhuangzi that are obviously fantastical, like that opening one about the bird and the fish and bird, that sometimes I let my presuppositions carry over from those passages to ones like this. Yeah, I think it's true that basically I thought this is yet another fantastical story. It's meant to be kind of like more idle thoughts or imagining fantasy outcomes or possibilities. And in fact, you're suggesting, no, it wasn't crazy. So readers of the time were not meant to think, oh, that's a crazy idea that you could have a gourd so big you could float it. In fact, that probably seemed like a realistic thing.
Or it could be like us. Like I read it, and the first 50 times I read it, I thought that's a crazy idea and I love it. And then I thought, well, let's see if you can do it. And I think it's pedagogical or therapeutic, or it gives you an epiphany that, oh, all along I thought it was not possible, but actually you can do it. And so there's a kind of philosophy as a way of life. There's sort of a embodied kind of philosophy in Zhuangzi for sure.
Although one thing I would wonder is it that easy to be able to shift your perspective? It can actually be quite difficult. And actually, I remember, maybe this has been discussed, but one of the things that has been difficult for creating really effective self-driving cars, because I think we had, or at least I had thought that we'd be much more advanced with that, because, Tesla came out a while ago, and I was like, how come we're not there yet? And it turns out part of it is because it's really difficult to teach machines how to perceive properly, like what to focus on, how to categorize things in a way that is important and significant. Like, how do you get someone to notice what is important or what is significant? And because if you think about it, like when you just look out into a room, we immediately see things under certain categories and we notice what's important. Like if a ball is flying at your head, you understand that you should duck. Or like if you see a house on fire, you immediately know that there's something really bad going on, partly because that's how we conceptualize these events. And so it's actually enormously complicated, it turns out, when it comes to figuring out, I mean, there's enormous sort of background knowledge that seems to be required to be able to see things under a certain light or from a certain framework or perspective, which is actually very, very difficult to teach. And in fact, it's kind of phenomenal when children learn these things. And that's part of the argument why there must be some kind of natural grammatical framework that people have, right? They're not like a blank slate. But so as I'm looking at like this text, Zhuangzi, of course, he's brilliant, he's imaginative, he's flexible. And of course, absolutely, that's very important. But I did wonder, like, well, Hui's, I guess part of what it is to be such a good logician is you're able to apply rules well, right? But you have this fixed number of rules. And so he's probably very quick at that, maybe even quicker than Zhuangzi, I would imagine. If you gave him like a problem on a paper with pencil, he could sort of derive. I remember doing some of that in my logic class, and some of my friends could do it so quickly, and I'm just staring at these problems for hours. But they were very good at sort of looking at how rules apply, whereas Zhuangzi is calling attention to maybe looking at other rules, or maybe even like asking questions about the rules themselves. So he's very adaptable and flexible. So that's really interesting. But at one point, Pauline, you did say you made it seem so natural and kind of spontaneous and easy. But I was wondering in the back of my head, like, is it that easy? I don't know. Because also, presumably,
you need to change your perspective, right? Is it that easy to change someone's perspective?
And also, and we've learned these things, and they're they've become embedded in our minds. And Weft naturally just looks at the gourd as, having these two functions. But one thing beautiful about Zhuangzi is he is calling attention to the fact that, no, these things, you can see things from alternative points of view. And in fact, that's when sometimes we really make advancements. And right, if you read physics sometimes, or philosophy of physics, that's what like brilliant thinkers like Einstein was able to do, like think things from a different point of view. And okay, no, I'm going to end the ramble there, but those are just some
can I agree with you?
Yes, you can definitely agree with me.
Okay,
I will.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Richard. I think that, and then can I add to what you just said and say, I often think that is the mission. It is so hard, so hard. Maybe it's like isn't it in the Tao Te Ching where it says like, my teaching is so easy and yet so hard. Yeah. And I think that is the Zhuangzi too here, that he's trying to get us to look broadly, and for some reason, so difficult to get us to let go. It's just a human nature thing. And so therefore he does all these, he has all these like clever, unexpected strategies. So it would be like the pung bird, so out there. And like some people need this. And then some people are like, actually, let me show you this thing that's right here in front of you. So many different kinds of strategies in order to try to untie us from limited vision, sort of like the anchor that is like limiting our vision. Because as you said, what was it? The Tesla car it's so hard to train someone to look in the right place or look more broadly. Yeah.
Mhm.
So just to agree 100% with you, Richard.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very, very difficult. Yeah, and you see this if you ever read Iris Murdoch, she has this beautiful little story of a mother-in-law who sees her daughter-in-law in this kind of rigid way, and she kind of starts resenting her, like thinking, "Oh, she's not good enough for my son." And but then part of process of becoming better and becoming a better person and cultivating yourself is to see things from other points of view. And so I think the mother-in-law in that story starts thinking like, well, instead of thinking her as a cheapskate, maybe she's being frugal, or
Mhm.
instead of being too, what are some of the other qualities? Like she just looks at these qualities from different angles and perspectives in a better light, and then is
Yeah.
able to kind of reframe the relationship in a healthier direction. But of course, that is very, very hard, right? It's like we kind of see it, and maybe that is the beauty of Zhuangzi. Maybe that is why he sometimes feels like he has to introduce these fantastical stories to kind of jolt you into a different point of view.
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting questions here. It's tempting to talk about specific techniques. That Zhuangzi does sometimes mention this idea of fasting the mind. And there's even a sort of a description of what it's like when you fast the mind in the so-called woodcarver Ching, or the kind of bell stand maker story, where he says the more he forgets until he's forgotten essentially about all the things that might be a source of stress or anxiety for him. And so that some people take that to be a reference to some kind of meditative technique. So through meditation, you forget about your sort of job duties and your employer and the threat of being fired for doing a bad job. And somehow that's supposed to free you up. I myself have to say, as someone who spends a lot of time writing, trying to write philosophy papers, that oftentimes I get really stuck in a rut and can't see my way out. And then I sleep on it. And for some reason, when I wake up the next morning, I realize that I can completely jettison some agenda I had before, and that I can say everything I want to more effectively, more powerfully, more persuasively or whatever, by just taking a completely different tack. Those are all concrete techniques. But I think if we wanted to generalize, I'm tempted to use Pauline's trope of sort of playfulness and childhood and say that basically he wants us to rediscover our child minds. Also,
Mm.
another reference to Leisure. Leisure talks a lot about the
Right,
child mind.
right. It's an
Um,
iconic essay, right?
yeah. So it's sort of like those kids who perform so well on the task that Ted Slingerland talked about, where you just give them, I'm not using the terminology exactly right, but kids haven't gone through that synaptic pairing yet. They haven't, the synapses in their brain that are meant to learn all kinds of ways of categorizing and understanding the world haven't been paired away according to what's actually useful for them or not. So they're still quite open-minded, and if we can somehow recover that state of mind, however we do it, that seems to be critical.
I like you're saying that you're thinking about a philosophical problem and then you sleep on it, and then the next day it seems so easy. And that
Yeah.
seems to be like a Zhuangzian thing, or you and I, because we read Liezhi together, I think about Liezhi too.
Yeah.
And he talks about that rest. Rest is the important, knowing when to stop, knowing when to rest, knowing how
Mm.
to rest is so important. And I mean, we probably have more questions about this passage. There's so much to talk about. But it makes
Hmm.
me think about the monkey passage that we talked about too. And it talks about Shou Yu Tian Jun. And
Yep.
it ends with the solution is resting in the heavenly. One translation would be something like the nature's potter's wheel, but resting in it, stopping there. I think for Zhuangzi, there's something about like, if you find your center, if you find the center, the axis of the cosmos, if you find your center, if you find the center of the potter's wheel, that's a place of rest and activity at the exact same time. And that's a place of play too.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. If it's all right with you, I'd like to just make the theme of playfulness a little bit more explicit here. So what we see in this passage is Zhuangzi, we see an advantage of play, which is that Zhuangzi has the kind of the more playful mind. Ah, I see. And
Mm-hmm.
playfulness understood in that way that I mentioned at the beginning as kind of purposeless, but yet joyful or delightful activity.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, it's precisely by achieving the state of mind where he's enjoying just kind of wandering around without any particular aim or purpose that he's able to see a use for these giant gourds that Huizi does not. So it's kind of the purposelessness of play that seems to be important here. Is that right?
Yeah, I see that here in this passage. And it's not, he says yung, use or
Hmm.
function. And Hui's is looking for use or function. And so for Zhuangzi, it's the being in the moment, floating down the river, floating in the lake. And
Hmm.
that, and he calls it, he doesn't use that word yo, which is often translated as play or wandering or roaming. But he uses a word fu, which is floating, maybe a synonym, maybe
Hmm.
related, a cousin word.
The
Yeah.
other thing that I've always really loved about the Zhuangzi, a common theme that we find in this passage and throughout the text, is this emphasis on what we might think of as like the non-instrumental. So
Mhm.
like leisure and like state of being where you're not going after something for the sake of another thing and the valuing of that. Because I think, I mean, most of human life, we are doing things for the sake of something else, right? We need to make money. I mean, and these are necessary things we have to do in human life. But at the same time, you might think, no, but at the end of it all, what are like the constituent sort of fundamental parts of a good human life? And it's not going to consist in some money making or instrumental good. It's going to consist in the
Yeah.
things that are like valuable for its own sake, like this kind of serenity in this, or it just this kind of relaxing, while you're floating around the river. That itself is something that we cherish. And I've been reading Lord of the Rings over the summer again, and the hobbits really get this, right? Because although, I mean, the hobbits end up sort of saving the world, like that's not at all like what their real thing is. I mean, what they love is smoking their, well, weed, I guess, and drinking their ale and living in Hobbiton, and just like they love partying and just kind of relaxing, and that's always been what they love. And of course, eventually, like things get corrupt, and because the world becomes corrupt, and so they have to get out there. But that's all still for the sake of returning to Hobbiton and relaxing and having a good time with friends and
Hmm.
enjoying this kind of leisurely life. And so that's like the final end. It's not money making or,
Hmm.
these other sort of like practical activities of that in that sense. And so I feel like the Zhuangzi, the authors really get that, the importance of returning our focus to those primary goods
Hmm.
that like we should be like always keeping in the back of our minds, even while doing the necessary tasks of human life.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, Richard. You're pointing to another dimension of the issue, which hasn't really come up yet. I phrased it in terms of categorical flexibility, where it's understood that like being more flexible about the category that you put things under enables you to make better use of them. But your point is like that there's like kind of a natural drift, really, when we think about usefulness to applying it toward instrumental goods, goods that are seen as like kind of open-endedly useful in achieving other things. And eventually we kind of start thinking about those instrumental goods as good in themselves, which is a big mistake. So we
Mhm.
almost need to sort of recapture that childlike state of mind in order just to appreciate what's really intrinsically worthwhile. There's this an example, I think it comes from Mill, that Western philosophers talk about all the time, where they say you can see how human beings tend to start to conflate instrumental value with constitutive or intrinsic value when in people's attitudes towards money.
Mhm.
Like when you're
Mhm.
very young, you understand that money is something you need in order to get other things, bubble gum or candy or toys or what have you. But over time, you start to like somehow relish and find gratification in just getting the money itself, even though
Mhm.
you're not actually getting the thing of value. You're treating it as if it's intrinsically valuable when it's not. So, and it does seem like Zhuangzi's suggestion is this obsession with usefulness really kind of marks a human tendency that we all have to see lots and lots of instrumental things as themselves intrinsically valuable, including our own value. There's this piece that Pauline co-authored with Helen de Cruz, really wonderful philosopher that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and where it seems to be saying, yeah, one problem is that people tend to, in some sense, assess themselves as human beings according to their sort of social contribution. And so, yeah, Zhuangzi is trying to discourage that habit of conflating instrumental with intrinsic value in those really pernicious ways.
Yeah. I think that this like whole looking at things cut in two, like this is the thing and this is what we want to use it for in order for like the ends and the means. Like you can see it in his gourd too. It's sort of the gourd. Huizi thinks it's supposed to be used to go do something. And like, can it do something? Can I fill it? And he says, does it roll?
Mm.
Can it hold something? And
Hmm.
he's like looking and seeing if it can hold something, because then if you can hold it, then you can use it to carry whatever you want and make it of use in order to get the end that you want. And there's this like oneness in the Zhuangzi, which is when he's thinking outside the, what did you call it? With this categorical flexibility,
Yes.
he
Hmm.
can think of the gourd as, it's not just the what can it hold, but it's also like, how does it relate? How is it one with the environment around us? And here then it's that it floats and you can sit in it. And it's not,
Mm.
it's no longer just what can it be filled with and what can it carry?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, sorry, Pauline, you were sort of nudging us toward the second passage. I feel like I should take your hint and
Oh, no, I was trying to do both at the same time. Yeah.
yeah, I see. Good. That was very artful. So I'll kind of set up the second passage. I guess, Richard, you were going to read it, but I want to start by reminding listeners, probably quite a few of them did listen to that first episode where we talked about this passage, the monkey trainer passage, but you may not remember it. It might have been months since you last heard it. So this very quick reminder, it's meant to illustrate how, in some sense, all the purposes we have, we think that there are actual stakes. We think that it actually matters what we do and what the outcomes are. But there's a perspective that I like to call the heavenly perspective, according to which or from which, in fact, they don't matter at all. There's a kind of basic equality or evenness in value. So from that perspective, the heavenly perspective, it's kind of laughable, really, that people behave as though it matters a great deal whether they get this job or whether they pass a course or what have you. And so the story tells us, we're kind of in really clear mathematical simplicity, what it would be like to see the world from that perspective by telling the story of a monkey trainer. It seems that he has to economize, and so he's cutting back the amount of nuts that he distributes to his monkeys every day. And so first he proposes 3 in the morning and 4 in the evening, and I think it's supposed to be morning at that time. So the monkeys are really upset because they're like, oh, this is our usual allotment is being curtailed. And then he says, okay, about 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening, and they're really pleased with that proposal. From his more heavenly perspective, it's just obvious that those are both policies are equal. They're equal in value. So that part we talked about at great length last time we discussed the monkey trainer episode. But one thing that we neglected last time were these very mysterious sounding lines at the end after the monkey trainer story has been told, after we've learned that the monkeys are all pleased and the monkey trainer has succeeded in some way. Yeah, Richard, you were going to read those last lines again so we could think about them a little more carefully.
Yes. Okay, sounds good. So this is actually the translation by Brooke Zipperin.
Yeah.
And here's the last lines of that monkey story. This change brought them no loss, either in name or in fact. But in one case, it brought anger, and in another, delight. He just went along with the thisness, relying on the rightness of the present this. Thus, the sage uses various rights and wrongs to harmonize with others, and yet remains at rest in the middle of heaven, the potter's wheel. This is called walking 2 roads.
Yes, there it is. Walking 2 roads. Right.
Yes, it's mysterious.
It is.
We translated this, right, Justin? Like
Yep.
at one point, when we were reading Zhuangzi.
How did you translate the last 2 lines?
I don't remember exactly what we said about it, Richard, but I'm aware of the controversy about this character Tianjun, Heaven's Potter's Wheel, or the Heavenly Potter's Wheel, or Heavenly Equality. Those are some of the candidate translations. This phrase Tianjun, by the way, there's a philosopher at Chinese University of Hong Kong, which is not where I teach, but the other kind of really large research university in Hong Kong. Actually, there's several, but he's a contemporary philosopher. He's from Taiwan, but he's analytic philosopher, and his name is Tianjun. His parents were Taoists, apparently, and a Taoist, some kind of Taoist cleric chose the name for them. I'm so jealous of him. I think that's probably one of the coolest names possible to have. Yeah, so how did we translate Tianjun? I think I probably just mentioned that there's this controversy. I feel like it's in some ways above my pay grade to figure out what the original historical meaning of Jun, which is being translated as Potter's Wheel, really was. Sorry, I don't remember. I love the translation walking 2 roads, though. What it says in Chinese is liangxing, sort of double walking, or I guess you could translate it in lots of different ways, like dualistic movement or moving 2 directions. But walking 2 roads, I think, captures what Zhuangzi is after best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't say too much about that last line, and I'm interested in what you think. The second to last line, I also can't say too much more about either, except I'm very interested in it. And it's,
Yeah.
to me, a very captivating image. And there are
Hmm.
related ones all through, peppered all through the Zhuangzi. And it's that idea of a center or an axis. I mean, you find it in many, many other Chinese texts in this time, Chinese philosophical texts. So, for
Hmm.
example, in the Analects, one of the famous passages is the person who has da, who has
Hmm.
charisma or power, moral charisma, is
Hmm.
like the North Star, and all the other stars revolve around it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Revolve around it. And
Yep.
so there's that image in the Analects, which is a Confucian text. And this is here then, he says, rest in heavenly potter's wheel, or else there's a different way to translate it too, depending on how you read that last character. I think it's
Hmm.
to me, very helpful, illuminating way to think about. So my subject is play that I'm thinking about, or playfulness, to think about
Hmm.
play or how to live life well as imagined by Zhuangzi. And for him, it's rather than we had talked about this idea of a magic circle, you had described it so well early on when we first started talking today.
Hmm.
And so play in a magic circle would be it's in the playground, it's within a circumscribed
Hmm.
space, it's on the Monopoly board. It has certain rules and it's very clear what is at stake. And there's one recent contemporary philosopher says what's going on when you play, or at least for games, is that you're making choices. You're like playing with the idea of different kinds of agency, and you can pick them up. So you can play Monopoly, you can play Battle, what is it called? Battleship, or you
Battleship.
can play
Yeah.
the Catan. There's something of
Hmm.
Catan. You can play
Settlers of Catan.
the Settlers of Catan. I like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
game. Or like there's a game called Pandemic, and then there's like the real life Pandemic, but which is not a game. But
Yeah.
you like what happens when you're playing is that you can play with certain agencies in that safe space.
Yeah. By the way, that philosopher is T. Nguyen.
Ti Nguyen. Okay.
Thi is the personal name, and the
Uh-huh.
family name Vietnamese is Nguyen.
And he has this big book called Games as Agency, which is a
Yeah.
wonderful
Hmm.
book. And I love that way of thinking about what's going on when you play. There's also a language that's not his, but there's other scholars. There's a book like a couple decades before that by an influential scholar of play. And he talks about play as a way to, there's this like natural selection kind of language, like to try out different things in order to cultivate your abilities so that you, in live life, you have these skills are developed well. So there's this like survival of the fittest kind of language. And to me, that's also interesting because it is a kind of, there's an underlying philosophy that is maybe not what we find in the Zhuangzi. And so then, of course,
Hmm.
play is going to look differently in the Zhuangzi if it assumes a different kind of self or a different kind of social space. And this idea of the Heavenly Potter's Wheel is a simple image, and there's other ones. He has one just earlier, like one paragraph before. There's a famous passage about debating this and that. And then he says,
Hmm.
really, what you want is you want to find the Dao Shu, the what is that? The axis of the Tao,
Yep.
right?
Hmm.
And so those are related images. There's another one where you find peace in chaos.
Hmm.
And so to me, this is a helpful, powerful way to think about social space and the self and the Zhuangzi that isn't either or a secular sacred, a self and society, this sort of division, or play in contrast to work, or play specifically as like 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, from the age of 25 to 65 versus the other times, which are the play space. But rather for Zhuangzi, there's this idea of you find your center, you think of yourself in a certain way. And when you find your center, when you find that axis, when you become the North Star, what else are the other images of this? When you find the center of the potter's wheel, or
Hmm.
I used to be a skater and my daughter's a ballerina. So when I watch her
Hmm.
do pirouettes, I actually think about spinning. They're called turning when they turn. And
Hmm.
skating, we spin. But
Hmm.
it is so hard. If you're off by a tiny, tiny, tiny minuscule bit, it suddenly
Hmm.
becomes very, very hard. But if you are like right on axis, it is so simple. And it makes me think of like,
Hmm.
I don't know if you're followers of figure skating, which I still remain one decades later,
Yeah,
but
of
Nathan
course.
Chen, who's
You
like
are.
the quad king and he won the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in figure skating.
Hmm.
I remember once watching an episode on him in TV, and he was asked when he was very young, like, why triples are so difficult, triple jumps are so hard, and how is it that you can do them? And he says, and he was young then, he's like, they're not hard to me. And I think that's right about Zhuangzi in life. Like, if you find that thing, what is here referred to as, you rest in it. It's simple. It's at ease. If you find that axis, you find the center, the pivot. It's actually really, really, really easy. And the hard thing is, it's sort of like what Richard was saying. It's so hard to see it for some reason. It's very difficult. But when you do, it's like, oh, so easy. And so that's why that particular, this image follows the monkeys being very, very upset, and sort of their emotions go to both ends, like excess of anger, excess of joy. It's not Zongyong, it's not the golden mean, the middle ground. And there's so much stress and strife preceding it. And then all of a sudden there's this like image where you actually find and rest in this axis, this center. I like this a lot too. When I think of reading the Zhuangzi, it helps so much, I think, to read it in terms of as a conversation with the other extraordinary philosophical texts preceding it or in its time, or like, this is Guozi. He has an image, and there's some other texts where the image is of a potter's wheel, but you're standing at the edge. And Mozi says you actually can't do well in life if you are standing on the potter's wheel, looking around with no sense of what's right and wrong and no sense of standards.
Yeah.
And so what a
a
contrast to
standard,
Zhuangzi, right? Such a contrast to Zhuangzi, who says the exact same thing, but he wants you at the center, whereas Mozi thinks of this image as if you were like nauseously, maybe even standing at the very rim, looking outwards. So external, internal, at the center, at the edges. I like this. I think this image that is peppered all the way through the Zhuangzi is very helpful in thinking about a lot of philosophical concepts that are central to his text.
Yeah, that's right. It figures really prominently in early Chinese texts, in so many philosophical texts, this idea that there's a kind of axis or pivot around which other things rotate. And there's so many passages. You mentioned the Zhongyong, which is a chapter in the Li Ji, the rites or the record of ritual. And yeah, you say Mozi. The Mozi, I think, if I remember correctly, it's a different character, Jun. It has the earth radical on the left side rather than the metal radical. But of course, all these texts come from some sort of seal script text that probably didn't make those distinctions. So it could have just been, whatever character was on the right. I think of it as kind of a yin character. And then later on, editors added some semantic component on the left to distinguish the different senses of the character. So it could be that even though we see different variations of the character, they all meant Heavenly Potter's Wheel. And it's useful to contrast the Zhuangzi from the Mozi. So Mozi says we need a fixed standard because otherwise we're just going through life on a potter's wheel, trying to make judgments, which will be variable according to where we stand and where the wheel is rotating at the moment. And so, whereas Zhuangzi seems to be saying, okay, the solution to that problem is to get off, both stay on the wheel and in some sense get off the rotating part of the wheel and get to the middle part, which is still.
Get into the middle, right.
Yeah, right. And then your point, I hadn't thought about this at all, is that like in the middle, it's actually quite easy in the middle. It like, suddenly a task that was very hard becomes almost effortless, just like for a figure skater who managed to do lots of spins. You're right. It looks miraculous from the outside. Those of us who see other people doing it because they spin so much you can't even count, and it seems amazing that they can like then put one skate down and land and not fly off lose their balance completely or what have you. And it also seems like they don't have enough momentum to spin that much. That's what amazes me, Yeah, so the connection to play, if I understand it correctly, is that, well, play is similarly easy. It's like, just like it is when you are in the axis or at the center point of some kind of spinning circle. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think that I love these texts because I think they're fun and they're thrilling to read and they're like gorgeous. I love the Zhuangzi for all those reasons. I have different emotional experiences each time I read the Zhuangzi. And I also really love the text because I think it has implications, or it can have implications for our real lives today. And so I think that if you think about the world like the potter's wheel in contrast to the magic circle, I think there's like real life consequence or policy differences too, consequences, implications. So if you think that everyone should play more and it's like a good thing, and you think of it as a magic circle, then it would be, well, we want to work Monday through Thursday, not Monday through Friday, or we want to help people retire at 62, not 65, or what we want the workday to end at 3 o'clock, not 7 o'clock or 5 o'clock. But if you think of it the way that I imagine Zhuangzi does with this image of the potter's wheel helping us think about how he thinks about play, then it's that if you have the right worldview, then it's sort of like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down a little bit, perhaps. But if you think about it in the right way, then so much more of life can be seen as play. And so Huizi doesn't get it. But if he thought about it more, like if he got the axis and he stood in the middle, or if Mozi did too, then you would actually be able to like take the gourd and float down the river. And we can think, or you could be the butcher carving up an ox, and there's a sense of joy in the moment and the sense of play. And in fact, he says that in that passage, that famous passage about Cook Ding, where he says, my knife, yo, he doesn't say he does, but he says, if the knife is a metaphor for him, it plays between the ligaments and the tendons and the main bones. So it's that sense of play in so much more of what we do than if we think of it simply as on an altar, in a temple, or on a game board, or on a stage. So I think that thinking about it in a certain way, it's not like the right way to think about play, but I think that thinking about it this way just adds so many more tools and expands our resources for enhancing our lives, enriching our lives.
So one thing you're pointing out, Pauline, is that so part of what Zhuangzi might be aiming to do is to show us a way of transforming our attitudes so that play permeates more and more of our life.
I think so.
And to understand it as not like segmented off aspect or a part of us that we can kind of look forward to down the road after we retire at 65 or whatever. But it's something that can actually, that's like available with the right attitude, the right way of thinking about these activities, even something as gross as butchering or whatever sort of crappy job you might be doing or whatever it is, it could actually be but it could be sort of transformed into an activity of play given the right way of seeing it. So that's, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so according to this Dutch anthropologist who talks about the magic circle, an essential requirement or prerequisite for play is that there be this boundary where it's understood that when you're within the borders of this magic circle, you're playing. So that's one thing, is there's like a shared agreement that you're playing when you're within these parameters. And then second of all, the boundary is sort of defined in terms of its consequences for the real world. So like, no matter how rich you get in Monopoly or poor, it's not actually going to affect how rich or poor you are in the real world. That's one of the reasons in virtue of which it's play. It wouldn't count as play if actually you were making yourself rich or poor, I guess. But Zhuangzi, on Pauline's reading, which seems right, doesn't want to suggest that there's a boundary in either of those senses. You shouldn't say, oh, here are the times where I'm at play, and here are the times where I'm doing serious stuff. There's a way in which at all times you're at play. Is that right? And then second of all, you shouldn't think about there being some kind of like guard against real world consequences. You're not supposed to care about real consequences at all, maybe? I don't know. I'm just trying to kind of elaborate on the metaphor here.
Right. Yeah, in terms of the boundary, like you said, between play is like more carefree and then something more serious in life. I think that's one of the thinks of play as something very serious. And it's, if you do life well and you do life seriously, then you perform life as play, which is a contrast to thinking of it simply as this fun thing that happens within a playground that doesn't have consequences.
Yeah. One thing that came up when Richard and I talked about detachment in the Zhuangzi in this last episode where we discussed the monkey trainer passage in great detail was I suggested that maybe one of the models of detachment that Zhuangzi might have in mind is essentially the same kind of detachment that we have toward games. And I actually used Monopoly as my example. I was like, just as you know when you're playing Monopoly that you're not actually getting rich or poor, and therefore you don't really care deeply about winning or losing, but you still play the game, right? So you're still attached enough to try to win the game. So too, maybe in life, are you striving for various goals, like becoming a doctor or a lawyer or what have you, or trying to live a healthy life and live to a ripe old age? And you understand at one and the same time that it's kind of worth pursuing those goals, just like it's worth trying to win the game. but it doesn't really matter from another point of view, just like it doesn't really matter whether you win Monopoly or not. And that's a kind of detachment that I call the Monopoly model of detachment. And then Richard pointed out that's a depressing insight in a way, like you want to have real stakes. You want to have like relationships that matter and goals and projects and that sort of thing. And so that just makes me wonder, is that a way in which sort of ironically Zhuangzi's attitude, his playful attitude toward everything that we do also is kind of a depressing insight, that it somehow takes all the meaning and purpose out of our activities.
So you think there might be something a little cynical about like the Zhuangzi? It's like you're a little bit detached. You won't become extraordinarily any one emotion, any direction, because you're not attached. I mean, he talks about being in but not of the world. And that is that. What did you call it? A monopoly. What did you say?
Monopoly model of detachment. Yeah.
Monopoly model of detachment. I think that's sort of right. I mean, you're in but not of the world. You're really in the moment, but you're not devastated by the consequences. And the question is that sort of, what did you say, Richard? It was the depressing view of the world.
Well, so like the extreme version of that is, what's that figure? Mengsan, what's that?
Mengsan Sai,
who like supposedly wails and weeps and sheds tears at these funerals or death of people that are close to him, but actually doesn't feel anything inside. It's not like he's actually grieving internally. He does perform. He does he carries out the ritual activity, but there isn't that depth of sorrow. And when I look at that, I'm like, that's pretty disturbing. That's not because if I really loved and I was attached, right? And I'm attached to my children or to my parents or my friends, then I feel that depth of sorrow. If I'm just performing outwardly and I have this weird detachment like it was part of a game, I don't know if that even allows for the profound relationships that I have. It seems to require a deep attachment of some sort. And so those are the kinds of examples that make me a little bit cautious about, or maybe I might also be maybe not fully understanding, or maybe there's a way of also harmonizing all this. And maybe even Zhuangzi himself would say, of course, that's not what I'm suggesting to do. So I'm not entirely sure. And again, Zhuangzi is so difficult. I mean, that's why there's that one interpretation that I guess a lot of our friends accept, like Eric Schwartz-Gable and many others, that he's offering a kind of therapy, right? That he's not necessarily saying to commit yourself to these specific beliefs or judgments, but it's a kind of a, what does he call it? Therapeutic skepticism, right? So he's not saying we really can't know anything, but it's that he's offering ways of reconceiving things, and we don't have to necessarily take some of these things literally. So that's, I guess, one way to kind of soften some of this.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that, Pauline? Those kinds of extreme, the character of Mengsan Sai. Don't you find that also a little bit troubling?
That is disturbing. Yeah, it is disturbing. I love this text. I think it's when you read it, you do have these extreme emotions too. It is very different than certain other texts that I'm very drawn to, like Li, who actually says good literature is the kind that comes deeply from the heart. It actually draws not from your blood and not from the bone, but from your bone marrow. And it sucks the bone marrow. And then you gnash your teeth and you cry and you wail. And that, at least that's his description of it. And you can think about what he means when he's saying it. But that to him is genuine feeling, pouring forth of emotions. And that's great literature. And he loves the Zhuangzi. He quotes from it. He has a commentary on it. That does not sound like the Zhuangzi here, right? That's what you're saying, right, Richard? Yeah, there's something about it. I don't know what the answer is. I don't have that one. Yeah.
Sorry to rehash old stuff, but I had this sort of offhanded thought last time we discussed this, which is that Zhuangzi is a non-ideal theorist, which is to say he's interested in giving us kind of goals that he thinks will improve upon the status quo, not necessarily goals that we think in the ideal case we want to actually instantiate. So if you assume, and I think this is a safe assumption, that we're way too attached to a lot of our projects and goals, and even attached to certain people and in relationships and so on, then it certainly can only help to become much, much less detached. Now, of course, if you become so detached or so unattached or something that you don't mourn the death of loved ones, well, that is disturbing. But he thinks you're never actually going to get there. I mean, the point is just to get you to care a lot less than you currently do about your next promotion or whatever it is, like who wins some sporting event or what have you, you know. That's one possible solution. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's trying to nudge us in a certain direction, sometimes using kind of extreme, exaggerated cases or stories,
Yeah.
without necessarily saying, "Yep," and that's the ideal. Yeah, that's right. I think this has come up in the past in our conversation of Zhuangzi. And you even find this like what in Confucius's teachings, right? Sometimes he teaches students differently depending on their dispositions or
Yeah.
proclivities, and then he'll say different things, and that's partly a kind of pedagogical purpose. So maybe Zhuangzi, we can also understand him as at times deploying a certain pedagogical strategy to, because generally he sees most people, yeah, too attached, too caught up in the hunt and the rat race or whatnot. And so he's
Yeah.
trying to pull us out of that using these more extreme examples.
Yeah, right. Just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page here, all of us and the listeners. When you talk about therapeutic philosophy or therapeutic uses of philosophy of the kind that Richard is suggesting Zhuangzi might use or adopt, the idea is that there are certain things that you assert to be true or you recommend to people or what have you in virtue of the fact that they have some therapeutic value. They're like good for you, you know, in terms of your kind of psychological, cognitive, emotional health. And not in virtue of the fact that they're true. And so normally when you think about philosophy, it seems like people are arguing about what's in fact true. And there's a way of reading Zhuangzi where he's not either asserting much about what's actually true or false, or for that matter, banking on things being true or false. He's just coming up with these really interesting ideas and views and frameworks and arguments to help you induce beliefs that would be therapeutically useful to you or something like that. And I think, you know, you're right. Certainly everyone does this. Everyone, all good teachers, when they recommend or make a point to a student, are in some sense taking account of the student's capacities and ability and their frame of mind and what have you. So it's therapeutic. So Kong's strategy is therapeutic to that extent. But I don't know if he'd go so far as to say, well, I'm totally indifferent to the truth of the matter. You know, that seems like a much more extreme stance that maybe Zhuangzi entertains, but doesn't seem like Kongzi/Confucius.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry to go on. Yeah, we've had this really great discussion. And I have to say, just speaking for myself, it's really eye-opening to think about the Zhuangzi in terms of play and playfulness and the kind of purposelessness or the sort of the sense that when you're playing, it's low stakes. That's a really useful lens through which to see the text. So, and it's one that being more like Huizi, I just didn't even see before reading your paper and discussing it with you, Pauline. So thanks for that reframing, that sort of radical reframing of the text. So yeah, we have this tradition where we ask a closing question of our guests. And I guess Richard was going to take the lead in this.
Okay, well, so the question we have for you, Pauline, is to name the one historical text, maybe other than the Zhuangzi, since basically everyone says the Zhuangzi, that you would recommend to listeners, and maybe just say a little bit about why.
Okay, so I get to say one text, is that right?
Yeah, sorry,
Okay,
just one.
let me think about this. I love the Zhuangzi, so my default's going to be the Zhuangzi, but I actually can say another text. If I were to be stranded on an island and I could only carry one text with me, and it can't be the Zhuangzi, I actually think it would be this text where the first time I read it, I thought it was like, I guess. And I was told it was a classic and I was told it was important. And in fact, one of the great translators of the Mongzi is Brian Van Norden. And he has a translation of this text. And I remember reading his introduction. And I thought, when I read what he wrote, that is kind of what I thought. He said, I read it and I thought it was kind of plain or something like that. It was more eloquent what he wrote. And then I came to understand why it was such a great classic and so important. In fact, it came to be to me, in my mind, Brian Van Orden says, one of the great texts of human history. And that's how I found this text too, which is the first time I read it. And it's a text where you read many of the passages when you're first learning classical Chinese. And I'm guessing part of the reason is it's put in in some ways simple, not convoluted or complex or twisty-turny, but kind of simple classical Chinese. So the writing, there's a kind of elegance about it or beautiful simplicity to it too. And when I first read it, and it says things like, it talks about like really looking within and thinking about like your original good instincts and then like developing this instincts. It says things like about how you should pay attention. So
Hmm.
you should cultivate daily. And so it's like this marathon of life, and you should just pay attention every single day to the very simplest things you do. And in that way, you can cultivate yourself and grow your instincts and become cultivated person and live a good life. And it's slow, step by step, nothing sensational, nothing dramatic. And I don't think there's
Hmm.
any passages about an extraordinary bird that's 300 miles long or floating down in a gourd or down a river. There's no like animals and plant life. And like, there isn't that fantastical imagery in this text. And I think that I've come to think that it's true. So
Hmm.
this text is true, especially, yeah, in living daily life. I come to think that it's actually incredibly, profoundly true. And that text is the Mengzi, so Master Meng, and it's one of
Hmm.
the early Confucian texts. So in
Mencius,
the
some
early
people say.
period, Mengzi,
Yeah.
yeah, Mencius. So Master Meng and the three well-known early Confucian texts are the Analects, the Xunzi, and the Mengzi, or the Analects, the Mengzi, the Xunzi in that historical order. And
Hmm.
the Mengzi, then, Richard, is the text that did you say favorite? Is that what you're?
That you would recommend,
That
maybe a bit more clear, maybe it might be something like that you would recommend to someone who is getting into classical Chinese philosophy or just Chinese philosophy in general and wants to learn more.
I would recommend the Mengzi. I might even recommend it over the Zhuangzi because I
Hmm.
think that I love the Zhuangzi. I love reading it. There's times when it's not like a guide for life, maybe for some of the reasons you brought up, Richard, but the Mengzi, almost always I have found it as a guide for life. And I think it's quite a radical text, despite it sort of deceptively seems simple, but it's extraordinarily radical because if you're interested in rituals and classics and external guides to living well and following the Tao, the Mengzi quite radically turns you subjectively, inwardly, to think about what are these instincts that you have. And he doesn't jettison anything that's external. He doesn't jettison the rituals. They're very important. The classics
Hmm.
are very important. Confucius is extremely important. They're all extremely important, but there's this like world very meaningful if we think about like degrees of changes being actually the trajectory so radically different. I think Moons is certainly extraordinarily radical then as a philosopher in his time. And in fact, he comes before Zhuangzi, right? And so I think that
Hmm.
in some ways, there's a setup. Like because Mengzi does this radical thing, Zhuangzi is able to do what he does. So I'd say again, then Mencius, Mengzi.
So what you liked about it is this kind of a Mengzi's kind of internal directed kind of
Mm-hmm.
self-awareness of
Mm-hmm.
our
Mm-hmm.
emotional, moral feelings and
Mm-hmm.
being sensitive to these, well, what of course he calls the moral sprouts in us. And you think that's actually true also. Like, is
Yeah.
that the part that really speaks to
Yes.
you when you said
Yes.
it's true?
I think it's true. I think he's a extraordinary guide to living well in life. I also think he's like extraordinarily hopeful. And
Hmm.
Hmm.
because he turns us more towards our internal, he says, our sprouts or our heart, because he turns us there, things can happen to you. You can be born in certain circumstances. And that's maybe harder to overcome or deal with or like kind of a challenge, but that's okay. He's very hopeful in that you have these internal resources that will enable you to navigate your way so that you are following the Tao, one with the Tao, sort of making your way forward on the Tao.
Hmm. You have what it takes. I've
Mm-hmm.
had students who would write to me years later, and they would actually more often than any other thinker mention the Mengzi as sort of
Hmm.
thing with them. Maybe because there's that slogan of human nature is good is very easy to remember. You kind of need these easy to follow slogans too. But just I guess, yeah, they found inspirational this idea that, yeah, within all of us, we have these like basic goodness or some kind of good
Hmm.
sort of inclinations and emotions that, yeah, maybe it's withered a bit, but you can always, it's never too late to start the process of
Almost always never too
growing
late,
them.
right?
Hmm.
Almost,
Yeah.
unless you're Bald Mountain, the one where
Oh, well,
all the
yeah.
sprouts are eaten
Yeah.
up.
Right.
Like you can be so neglectful that
Yeah.
we don't need to talk about contemporary politics, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, right. I know what you're referring to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still very hopeful in that regard, generally. Right. Very
Yeah. It's a great answer. I particularly like the point, Pauline, that you made sort of just in passing, which is that There's a phrase we sometimes use, inside out. They're the philosophers who are sort of outside in, so they describe things from the so-called objective point of view, and then maybe they make inferences to what it's like internally. But there are other philosophers who kind of start with internal point of view. Zhuangzi seems like one of those for sure, compared to others. And then Zhuangzi does too. So you're thinking maybe Zhuangzi took his cues or something from Zhuangzi in that respect.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think Mengzi is maybe the more radical one, and Zhuangzi is sort of doing a really good job of extending him.
Yeah.
Can we write a paper on that?
Yeah, that's very intriguing.
Did you read that paper by David Nevison? You must have. I like this one where he says, if Zhuangzi, and this is just to contextualize, like Mengzi on one side and Xingzi on the other side and Zhuangzi in the middle. If Zhuangzi would have thought about rituals and the human condition a little bit longer, he would have thought his way to Xingzi.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, he does say that.
Yeah. So I find that like eye-opening and sort of a way to rethink like the relationships among all these different thinkers in that time.
Yeah. I'm very sympathetic to that view, actually. I guess it's one of the ways in which maybe Nevison influenced me and I hadn't quite realized it. Yeah, that's an unusual reading of Zhuangzi, but it seems right to me. So Zhuangzi was that close to recognizing the value of these seemingly artificial constructions, rituals, at least in terms of like their ability to reshape our character.
Yeah, I think he was talking about grief and how Zhuangzi is saying, well, this is just what happened. And so why should I be upset? This is Zhuangzi's wife's death. And then Nevison says, but if he would have thought a little tiny bit longer, he could have thought his way to Xingzi, who actually got it right, which is we have these rituals that were created in part by heaven, in part by humans. And it helps us move our way forward through this natural thing, grief.
Yeah, exactly.
I am sympathetic to that too.
It's a good example too. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much, Pauline.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. It's so fun to like see you guys and talk to you guys, and we'll have to meet in person.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. Take care. We'll say that was the way for today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.